I think. Are you ready?
Sure. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get us started. So welcome, my name's Rebecca Slayton. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies, jointly appointed in the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies here at Cornell. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on Cornell University's campus, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Gaia-Kahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gaia-Kahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, in the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gaia-Kahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gaia-Kahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Ambassador Thomas Armbruster, who has a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, including serving as the Nuclear Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. As a Foreign Service officer, Tom served in Helsinki, Finland, Havana, Cuba, Moscow, Russia, Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, Dushanbe, Tajikistan, Vladivostok, I should have practiced this, Russia, and Mahuro, Republic of the Marshall Islands. He served as ambassador to the Marshall Islands from 2012 and 2016, and since then has served in senior advisory roles at the U.S. mission to the United States Nations and the U.S. Embassy Nuku'alofa, Tonga. He led Inspector General missions to Colombia, Denmark, Chad, Mauritania, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And he's distinguished by many things, but I think my favorite is that he's the only American diplomat to travel to the Soviet Union by kayak, paddling with a group of Finns from Helsinki to Tallinn. So please join me in welcoming.
I think the only thing you forgot is I was an ice cream scooper.
Oh.
The favorite one was that.
What was that?
That was most favorite one.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Aiden, thank you. And Upasana for kicking this off. Thank you very much. And to the Repi Institute and Patricia. You all have a requirement, I think, to take science, but not necessarily physics. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Okay. Has anybody taken nuclear physics? Anybody? How about just regular physics? Okay. All right. And I'm going to ask you guys to keep me honest because this is my generalist brain's understanding how nuclear power and nuclear weapons work. Basically, you have to get the atoms moving. And in a nuclear power plant, you can do that with the fuel rods. Fuel rods have uranium-235. You bring them close enough together, they start to react, and the neutrons hit other fuel atoms, releasing more neutrons, and you have a chain reaction, releasing energy. In a nuclear weapon, it's a little different. Same principle, you're still going to get the neutrons moving around, they're going to hit other fuel atoms, but instead of having water or gas moderate that reaction, you're going to have a massive uncontrolled release of energy. And it's the plutonium is actually like a bowling ball. I think the exact weight is classified, but you have basically a ball surrounded by high explosives. Those explosives implode on that ball, and that starts that reaction. With fusion energy, it's the same process again, same principles, but the atoms actually fuse together. Whereas fission, they split. Fusion energy is what powers the sun, and what they say is someday going to be our future energy source. We'll see. So whether we're talking about weapons, nuclear power plants, life, education, I do think one thing leads to another. And this is sort of the metaphor for this class, is that people, events, ideas come to you, and they'll start a chain reaction that leads to other things and makes the outcome seem almost inevitable. Was the nuclear stuff okay for you nuclear guys? Did that make some sense? Okay, good. I had to do that to get what they call a Q clearance, which is a top secret clearance for the Department of Energy to report on nuclear stuff and to read that kind of material. So I'll talk about the links in the chain that brought me to Artemis 16, or Sarov, which is Russia's one of their premier nuclear labs, and also to Runit Dome in the Marshall Islands, and links bringing me to you. You all have your own chain reactions, careers, friends, contacts, and travel that lead to other things. And I hope that this discussion might lead to some ideas for you and take you in directions you might not have thought about. So my chain of events, an environment class in 8th grade sent me out on the Chesapeake Bay with an oysterman, and that sparked a lifelong interest in environmental issues. A year in Moscow with an American diplomatic family when I was 17 started the whole diplomatic chain reaction. And I spent 6 years in journalism because the State Department took that long to figure out how much I could contribute to foreign policy. So environment, journalism, and diplomacy are the raw materials, the plutonium-239 and uranium-235, that fuel some of the chain reactions in my life. My first-hand experience with the consequences of nuclear weapons was in Hawaii as a reporter. I interviewed a Hiroshima survivor, and I can still hear her saying, I don't want it to happen again. Not to you, not to me, not to anybody. Very sincere, very simple message, but it's stayed with me for a long time. After Hawaii, I joined the Foreign Service. I had tours in Helsinki and Havana, and then worked as a polar affairs officer in Washington on Arctic Council issues. The whales, polar bears, indigenous issues was really a great portfolio. And I helped organize something called RADEX. And that was an exercise in Anchorage where over the course of several days, policymakers, scientists, and nuclear experts simulated a release of nuclear, a nuclear accident. Basically, what would we do if we had another Chernobyl in the Arctic? We called it Arctic land because nobody wanted to call it Bolivino, which was the Russian plant. But that's what we were really targeting, is what would happen if the Bolivino plant suffered that same type of meltdown. All 8 Arctic countries participated, including Russia, and they would discuss as this plume of radiation spread, when do you distribute iodine? When do you close the schools, et cetera? How do we do a better job if there is another Chernobyl? That exercise was a win. So on to Russia as nuclear affairs officer at the US Embassy. And originally they said I'd be the environment officer. And I thought, great, polar bears, indigenous issues, all the stuff I really liked. But bait and switch, I got there and said I'd be the nuclear affairs guy. And I resisted until I realized that really nuclear issues are the biggest environmental issues out there. As a diplomat, I came to see the inextricable link between nuclear weapons and environmental catastrophe. Whether it's Chernobyl's radioactive fallout or Runit Dome in the Marshall Islands, the environmental scars left by nuclear testing and accidents are inseparable from the history of the conflict. And you were talking about that in regards to Vietnam as well. Peace and environmental stewardship go in hand. So let's take stock a little bit on our view of US-Russian relations. How would you characterize Russia as a state actor today?
In what way?
Well, in terms of its how it's perceived in the world, how it acts in the world diplomatically. Is it rules-based or?
Russians, I guess.
It's very Russian. What's that?
Expansionist.
Yeah, I think
agree with that.
expansionist, imperialistic. I think all those things that we see with respect to Ukraine. Going back to the 90s, which is kind of before your time, so it's not a fair question, but was Russia the same type of actor? You think so?
Yeah.
I'm going to change your mind. I hope. Yes.
I feel I'm not much aware of the history of 90s related to Russia's power torsor actions. But what I really know now is like Russia is, Russia becomes more kind of aggressive and thirsty of power and expansion and all that. as long as they feel kind of threat from any other sources of power globally. Because as long as I know about like the nature of Putin himself, he's still thinking about like creating the Russian Empire thing. And like, he's still in that era. And he still feels that Russia is a power and no other power has the right to threat Russia. So I feel like that.
And you're right. And I think that feeling of insecurity was really sparked after the Yugoslav, well, actually, going back to the 90s, back when Yugoslavia was bombed by NATO. I think Russia thought, wait a minute, this could happen to us. And that kind of turned the tide. Just after the fall of the Soviet Union, we really saw a lot of insecurity and questioning about Russia's role in the world and where they were going. And there was an opening, there was a window for cooperation. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now and sort of change your mind about maybe change your mind about Russia's attitude towards the rest of the world. At the embassy, I worked with a man named Alexei Davidov. And luckily, we still had Russian staff at that time. He was a Chernobyl first responder, but luckily, because he was at his dacha, he was a second responder in this case. They couldn't reach him. So he got there a little bit late. He was still exposed to radiation. He has a lifetime pass on the Moscow Metro for his heroics, but he wasn't one of the folks who died. And I think, Aiden, can I go back to the beginning of the slides?
Oh, yeah, I think this is the first slide.
Oh, this is the thing.
Oh, there's a clicker.
Yeah. Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah. Thanks. This is back, I guess.
I think this is the first slide.
Oh, okay. Oh, let's bring it down. Oh, sorry. I thought it sent, sorry about that. Well, I did send an updated one, but that's okay. Mitino is a cemetery outside of Moscow. And I had a picture of the cemetery, and what they did for the 28 firemen who died at Chernobyl was create death masks, basically. And every year, on the anniversary of the explosion, people come and bring vodka and flowers and all kinds of things and leave them at the grave sites. And I went one year with Alexei, and we saw a little girl polishing the mask of maybe her grandfather or somebody. Very, very moving thing to see. I can send that around. That's me to know. So the US and Russia started cooperative programs on nuclear issues. And by then, American and Russian scientists had gained some measure of friendship. They exchanged photos of their grandkids, and the nuclear programs were vast. There's a vast array. I'll give you a few of them that were very successful. Material protection, control, and accounting. This was safeguarding Russia's nuclear weapons with cameras, computers, and alarms. The HEU-LEU agreement, this was the big ticket item, also called megatons to megawatts. And that converted 500 metric tons of Russian highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium for burning in nuclear power plants. It was enough power to power the entire US energy budget for 2 years or provide 10% of total power needs for 20 years. 20,000 warheads were taken off the street, generating $17 billion for Russia. But that was really a big win with an asterisk. Is that program something that you all have heard about? You have, yeah. And Arpit, I think we did a bad job. We certainly did a bad job promoting it with the Russians, but I don't think we did a great job explaining it to the American people. I mean, some PR genius came up with megatons to megawatts, which is a really great slogan, but for most people, they had no idea. So I kind of give that success an asterisk. Other programs got started, but never achieved critical mass. A plutonium disposition agreement was signed in 2000, suspended by Russia in 2016. That was taking plutonium and vitrifying it, basically turning it into glass. And that's something that they're still doing it at some of the national labs. They're still working on that. Work on next generation nuclear reactors was initiated, then halted. Had that continued, maybe we would have fusion energy already. The Nuclear Cities Initiative was also very, very ambitious. These are all Department of Energy programs. But this was to retrain Russian scientists to civilian projects. The leader, the person who came to Moscow usually as the point person was Rose Gottemuller, who you all had in your readings. And we'll meet her again a bit later. But she had this vision for nuclear cities that all the weapons labs in the US would have a sister weapons lab in Russia so that they could really develop ties and work together. Sarov, or Artemis 16, was one of their premier nuclear sites where scientists lived and worked. For America, we build fences around the laboratory. For the Soviets, and then for the Russians, they built fences around the whole city. And those cities were reserved for the creme de la creme. It was really the elite who lived there. I flew to Sarov with Senator Pete Domenici, who was one of the architects of the nuclear programs. And here's the asterisk. When we were there, one of the Ministry of Atomic Energy officials said, "You destroyed us." That's how he saw the end of the Cold War. And when you looked at Sarov and you saw the abandoned grand piano and tattered curtains, cobwebs in the ballroom, you could really see that, yeah, we cut for the elite for a certain period of time. We did destroy that way of life for some of the Russian scientists, Soviet scientists. And adding to the resentment, there was no image of America's cooperation, no real public diplomacy effort. It would have made a real difference if the average Russian could have said, yeah, my kid was born in the American hospital or goes to school at the American school. But the Russians never made it easy either. Their motto seemed to be, we're not going to just roll over and take your money. They even kicked out Peace Corps and USAID as this change to a more aggressive foreign policy emerged. So aviation investigators look for a causal chain in an accident. Maybe the pilot slept late, then skipped something on the pre-flight checklist. And for me, the causal chain explaining why the Baltics became successful European states while Russia reverted to imperialism and repression lies in our decision not to pursue a Marshall Plan, to not only get Russia on its feet, but show the Russians who we are. The Baltics sort of were adopted by the Nordic states. So Finland looked out for Estonia, and Sweden and Norway looked out for Lithuania and Latvia. But we never really took on that role fully in the United States for Russia. I did write a memo at one point urging that we do that, to do more visible public diplomacy things. And I was physically threatened by a staffer for the assistant ambassador. So there was no appetite for anything that didn't center directly on improving America's national security. And when you think about it, Russia still had nuclear weapons, so they could revert to a zero-sum game at any time. And the Russians were not teddy bears either. At one point, we picked up sensors, picked up a seismic event in the Kola Peninsula. And so as nuclear affairs guy, I asked some of my Russian scientists, hey, is this some subcritical test or something? And he didn't really want to answer. And the next day I saw a little red laser dot on my shirt on the way home on the bus. And I thought, okay, that's probably not a good question to ask. So they're very sensitive and is even more so today. Of course, the causal chain explaining Russia's view could go all the way back to the Mongols or to Napoleon or to the Nazis. You know, they've had a history with foreign powers that can explain to a certain extent their xenophobia. There may be another window after Putin, and this is golden opportunity number one. Maybe one of you will be the architect of a new US-Russian relationship. Maybe Cornell could open a sister institute in St. Petersburg or Moscow or Kamchatka. But we need to do better next time the window does open, if and when it does. Maybe Putin has it all lined up and we won't get a chance. One other thing to think about regarding Russia and Ukraine is Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world until we convinced them to give them up in return for security guarantees. So that was the US, UK, Ukraine, and Russia all signed the Budapest Memorandum. And that brings me to a question for you that I haven't really figured out. Is the lesson that if you have nuclear weapons, you should hang on to them? Or will Ukraine come out of this as an intact democracy without the burden of a nuclear arsenal? If you're Ukraine, if you could go back in time, would you keep the nukes or not? You would.
Looking at how like now, like Ukraine have been treating like, since the starting of war. And, I feel at least like nowadays, looking at how the world is treating Russia, like the world is not being so harsh and like hard on Russia. The only fear is here that they will start a nuclear, a war. So if Ukraine had a nuclear weapon, I don't believe Russia was able to do this entire aggression
Yeah.
and start this war. So
Or
it can be maybe I'm wrong, but that's my understanding for there.
Yeah.
So retrospectively, do you think Russia would have ever allowed Ukraine to have a nuclear weapon?
I think in those early days, maybe so. And part of the lesson is as well is if you give security guarantees, you really have to have a plan to provide the security to back that up. If Russia had thought we can't go into Ukraine because the US and Great Britain are going to intervene, I think we might have had better luck. What do you think about Putin's nuclear saber rattling? Is that effective?
Is effective, I believe,
Hmm.
because why don't we see NATO troops on Ukrainian soil?
Yeah.
It was not that serious.
Personally, I think he enjoys his lifestyle and would not want to blow it up, so to speak, but it has been effective. You're right. Definitely. Other comments on Russia? I'm gonna move on to yes, sir.
And just note on the question on Ukraine, I think Ukraine was pretty reluctant to let go of the nuclear weapons. And it was actually US foreign policy that was very, very kind of strong.
Persuasive.
Forcing Ukraine basically to give up the and so I guess in hindsight and even in the reality, they were pretty reluctant and they knew that it might be better to have them.
Yeah, yeah. And that negotiator, again, was Rose Gottermuller, by the way. She was one of the main point people negotiating with the Ukrainians. And I read a piece that she wrote about a year ago or so, where she still thinks that was probably the best thing for Ukraine in the long run. I don't know if she's since changed her opinion after 3.5 long years of war. But yeah, it certainly didn't work out very well.
I'm just curious, you said that Putin likes the good life. Over here, one thinks how much of individual psychology can have huge repercussions for the world, just in case he feels suicidal personally. It could dramatically change the world because are these things taken into account, the calculations of what may be going on in a person's mind? I'm curious.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Intelligence agencies study leaders very thoroughly. And Putin is one that they look for all sorts of clues. And there are rumors that he's not healthy. So maybe if he thinks he's dying, he feels he has nothing to lose. So yeah, you're right. When one person has the power, then it's hard to analyze a nation's motives and intentions because there's one person. Yeah. Anything else on Russia? Yes, sir.
So you were the ambassador. So is it true that Putin is the only person who runs the entire nation of Russia? I mean, a state doesn't operate like that in general sense, right? There is a group of people who runs a state, be it US, be it India, be it any other country. So is Russia completely dependent on President Putin?
Well, I was a lowly science officer in the embassy. The ambassador, I've worked for a couple ambassadors, but one was Bill Burns. And I think if you really want a good look at Russia. His book, I think it's something like I'll find it for you, but Bill Burns has written a book about his time as CIA director and ambassador to Russia, and he's very insightful. When we had Bill Clinton coming for a visit, the ambassador wrote what they call a scene setter. This is the Russia you're going to encounter when you get off the plane. And it was better than anything I'd read in the Post or New York Times. I mean, it was the history, the psychology, just brilliant. And
Is the name of the book The Back Channel?
thank you. I was thinking the back room, yeah. Bill Burns, The Back Channel. You get a chance to read it. But to answer your question, I think that he thinks of himself, Putin thinks of himself more like a czar than a convener of the government. And I also wonder if he wonders if he has full legitimacy too, because he's used all these levers of power all these tricks to kind of stay in power by being prime minister and then stepping down. And so I think he may have some insecurity of his own about his legitimacy in the eyes of the Russian people. Yeah, good question. So the State Department has career tracks, and those are political, economic, public diplomacy, consular, and management. But for a brief time, there was an environment, science, and technology track that I switched to. And then when I was in Moscow, they eliminated that track. So I joined political and had leadership roles, consul general twice, deputy chief of mission, and the work ranged from sports diplomacy, helping Americans in prison, to counter narcotics, sometimes all in the same day. And then President Obama nominated me to be ambassador to the Marshalls. The Senate confirmed me, and the Marshallese accepted me after what they call agrément. And that's the host country's chance to say yes or no to an incoming ambassador. But before they did, they had two questions. Do I fish and do I drink Budweiser? And I said yes to both. So I guess I passed the test. So you can see that the Marshall Islands is out in the middle of the Pacific. I think I've already lost my clicker. About 4 hours west of Honolulu.
I think it needs to be.
Thank you. Yeah. And they don't think of themselves as a small island country, but rather a large ocean country. They have about 750,000 square miles of ocean that is part of their territory. So on to Runit Dome and more Cold War fallout. This is not a place I worry about. If it's ever come up on your radar, they even mentioned it in the Diplomat, the TV show. There was a brief reference to it, but it's basically a concrete cap that covers nuclear debris that was bulldozed into a big pit. And then they just covered it with this concrete. And every now and then you'll see articles that say, it's cracking and it's going to leak. And the problem is that it already communicates with the sea. At the bottom of the pit, there's ocean water, and the radionuclides tend not to migrate very much. So Department of Energy does monitor it, and it's not a doomsday scenario, but it requires maintenance and attention, just like the U.S. Marshallese relationship. And I think because of the 67 nuclear tests that we had there, we have a moral obligation to look out for the Marshalls. And you guys were talking about what's the moral responsibility. We also have a legal obligation under what they call the Compact of Free Association. And what the Marshallese really worry about right now is not the nuclear legacy so much, although that's definitely one of their top issues, but it's really more about sea level rise. And sorry about that. It's really more about sea level rise and climate change. It's an atoll nation, and I'll pass this one around, that you can see how low it is to the sea. It's about 6 feet above sea level on average. A little bit more context about the Marshall Islands. There were quite a few battles there. during World War II. 4 medals of honor were awarded to servicemen, mostly who threw themselves on grenades. And there's still an army base there, an army garrison, which is a pretty important part of our national security architecture. It's called the Reagan Space and Missile Defense Base on Kwajalein. We shoot rockets from Vandenberg in California, and they land in Kwajalein Lagoon. They also send some missiles up from Kwajalein. So there's a big security relationship between the United States and the Marshall Islands. And it's funny, these days they're talking about restarting nuclear testing. And then somebody clarified and said, no, we're just talking about delivery systems. And I feel like, well, they've been doing these delivery system tests for years, so that's not anything new. So I think they really are thinking about restarting nuclear testing. So I invited Rose Gottemuller to come to the Marshall Islands. She had gone from Department of Energy to Department of State, became the Undersecretary for Arms Control. And I asked that she mark Remembrance Day, which is the day, March 1st, 1954, when we tested the largest hydrogen bomb ever. It's called the Bravo test or Castle Bravo test. And the winds either shifted or, according to some, the Navy deliberately used the test to see the effects of radiation on the nearby population. People were exposed, people developed cancer and died, and it is tragic. The test is marked every year with Remembrance Day. And in her speech, which I know is in your reading, but for those of you that didn't have the reading, I'll give you just a paragraph or so. She said, "I know that words can only go so far in healing wounds, but this nation has played an outsized role in the fight for a safer world. And for that, the United States and the world thanks you. Of course, the mutual security of our nations is an underlying element of the special relationship between our nations. Marshallese citizens serve with distinction in our armed forces, sharing our commitment to democracy and freedom. On this day, the 60th anniversary of Castle Bravo, and on each and every day, the United States recognizes the effects of its nuclear explosive testing and has accepted and acted on its responsibility. Since 2004, the United States has provided over $600 million to the Marshalls in the form of direct assistance and subsidies, as well as financial support for rehabilitation of affected atolls, site monitoring, and ongoing healthcare programs. This year, DOE initiated a remarkable sponsorship program to increase the science capacity in the Marshall Islands. 2 Marshallese students will live and study in the San Francisco Bay Area, including at Lawrence Livermore National Labs. And then she goes on to call for U.S. ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which 187 countries have signed and 178 have ratified. Disarmament is not just about treaties, it's about education. By understanding the history and legacy of nuclear weapons, you can push for new frameworks that prioritize peace, security, and the environment as future leaders and policymakers. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty remains unsigned by the U.S. and other key nations. Educating ourselves and advocating for change is part of disarmament. My 4 years in the Marshalls showed me how people live with the daily consequences of decisions made decades ago. Nuclear disarmament and stewardship must never be a forgotten priority. That scholarship program that Rose mentioned is important because the Marshallese have a basic distrust of the U.S. officials. So they really need to go get educated about nuclear issues and decide for themselves when they can go back to Bikini and resettle there. And what's the one thing in your reading with Rose Gottemuller, did you catch the one thing she didn't say? Was there anything missing in that speech that you were kind of hoping for? You never said, "We're sorry," which nations tend not to do, at least the United States tends not to do. And I don't think it would have hurt us to say that that was a mistake, but you know, you've moved on a generation, it was a different time. It's a difficult thing, but it's something that I think policymakers have to consider when going back to countries that have suffered from wars that we've played a part in. Rose was definitely moved by her visit to the Marshall Islands, and she asked us to come up with a list of potential development projects. So we came up with a list of new airports, roads, schools with several billion dollars. I said unfortunately when I wrote this, but listening to your discussion, I don't know if that's the right word. Fortunately or not, the Marshallese decided to take the United States to the International Court of Justice on the nuclear legacy issue, seeking environmental justice. So that's certainly their right, something they could continue to do. But they did lose that opportunity, I think, for a pretty big infusion of capital from the United States. And there have been missteps and miscommunications. The Department of Energy at one point reported polonium levels, mistaking that for plutonium, reported that to the Marshallese, and the Marshallese left Bikini. This is back in the 60s. The good news is that levels of some radionuclides like cesium-137 can be lowered or neutralized with the application of potassium. So there's a way to remediate the soil. The marine environment has also recovered, rebounded. Shark Week even did a special on the shark population. And as I said, as important as nuclear issues are, it's climate and sea level rise that are the existential threats. And that has produced some very powerful advocates for change from the Marshall Islands. Statesman Tony DeBruym, what they call the High Ambition Coalition in Paris, bless you, that tried to keep the goal of capping global warming at 1.5 degrees. Tony witnessed the Bravo test at age 5, and he passed away from cancer in 2017. Another powerful voice is poet Kathy Jetnell Kitchener. I sent this poem to the United Nations Committee seeking worldwide candidates for the 2012 Civil Society Speaker at the Climate Summit. And if I can figure this out, I'll show you what the committee saw. Let's see.
I can put it in presentation.
Yeah, if you would, that would be great.
We have the videos.
Thanks. Yeah. that phrase, we've never wanted to leave, really refers to bikini and displacing the population.
As.
Oh, wow, okay.
During the holiday.
Yeah, that's important. Shopping done early.
Oh.
Well, I think we'll jump into her, this is then the result of her audition for the UN. Good. They said that was the first standing ovation since Nelson Mandela addressed the UN General Assembly. So she's powerful. So this is golden opportunity number 2. Go to Bikini and determine the steps to ensure it's habitable. Cornell students and faculty could play a huge role. It's safe to visit, but not to live off the land. What else? Awareness. When you hear the word bikini, the Bravo test is probably not the first image that comes to mind, but people should know about the Marshall Islands and the price they paid for our national security goals. One other related issue, and maybe it's not a related issue, maybe it's just my pet issue, but deep sea mining. Marine scientists advocate that we follow the precautionary principle. If we don't know the effect of a certain policy or action, don't do it until we do. And that was certainly disregarded with respect to nuclear testing. The same thing with deep sea mining. We don't know the effects of it. We don't even know all the organisms in the deep sea. So let's not engage in deep sea mining until we really know the outcome. Any questions on the Marshall Islands? Or comments, I should say comments. Well, I hope I also gave you a glimpse of the breadth of foreign service work and why it's a risk to national security to slash the State Department budget and workforce. So I'll do another commercial after the Christmas commercial to recruit you all, with the caveat that the Foreign Service of today is not the Foreign Service I left in 2016. One of the core tenets since World War II has been universality, the idea that we should have embassies everywhere because we have Americans everywhere and interests everywhere. And it's threatened by the current budget cuts and strains of isolationism. But actually, I haven't seen that yet, so that's hopeful. There are fewer career ambassadors now. They tend to be more political appointees. But I think the career does really offer real challenges. It gives you an opportunity to learn languages and make a difference. So that's golden opportunity number 3, to take the Foreign Service exam. And I would like nothing better than to see one of you, all of you, raise your right hand and swear an oath to the Constitution. Today's fight for nuclear disarmament and environmental justice needs all hands: physicists, policymakers, environmentalists, advocates. Whether your passion is law, science, education, or community engagement, I urge you to find your link in the chain that brings about real change. Let people know the true costs of nuclear weapons and conflict. Be a voice for disarmament and responsible stewardship in the class, the lab, and public service. And join global efforts to heal the scars of past testing through research, policy work, and education. Nuclear weapons are so indiscriminate, I think using one would have to be considered a war crime. And yet we've produced thousands of them. We still have to maintain them, decommission them, and store them every day from now until forever. And we need to be good stewards of what we've produced. As the Blue Oyster Cult song Godzilla says, history shows again and again how nature points up the folly of man. Our challenges are man-made: climate change, nuclear stewardship, deep sea mining. And I'll close, if we have it, with some wisdom from Marshallese statesman Tony DeBroom. There we go. Thank you very much. Rebecca, I turn it back to you.
All right.